Who are you?
I'm no one.
I was raised to do one thing. But I've got nothing to fight for.
Nothing will stand in our way. I will finish what you started.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it. The dark side. A Jedi. They're real.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
I gotta say, that trailer brings it out of me every time I watch it. It makes me a little teary. It's just such an amazing trailer. I'm curious, how much, did you have any part in cutting that trailer? Did you see it for the first time when the marketing team brought it to you?
They brought a version of that. They've been incredible, and they were incredibly collaborative, and we worked with them and put together that trailer. But a lot of passes, iterations, a lot of notes, but they were great.
Now, so many people, including members of your cast, saw that trailer and cried. They cried uncontrollably. I think there's YouTube videos of just several people crying at that trailer. The realization that Star Wars is back and it's real and it's possibly better than it ever was, or the new incarnation is going to be great. Did you have a moment when you were working on this movie, either in the script stage, editing, or while shooting it, where you were overcome with the emotion that you were bringing Star Wars back?
There were moments, I'm not kidding you, like daily, where I would feel, I would realize what we were doing, and it would threaten to paralyze me, because it was just an incredible thing to be a part of it at all. But I wasn't there to be a fan, and so I had to sort of accept that, but also just focus on the work at hand. But literally from the very beginning, the conversations with Kathy Kennedy, and thinking about the whole process of working with Lawrence Kasdan, who had written Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and to work with this amazing cast, the original cast, as well as these, the new actors we would find, to work with the people in post-production, or John Williams. Yeah. I mean, it was mind-blowing, the notion of it at every step. So the answer is 100% yes, and also it was not what I was there to do. So I had to make sure that I was as excited as I was inside, I was focusing on the work at hand.
Was there ever a moment where you could take that time that you might have needed to be excited about it, or did you feel like you had to plow through as much as possible?
No, it wasn't like, I wasn't able to sort of be present in that way, but it's a strange thing. I'd never worked on something that I cared about so desperately beforehand. I mean, I came to love Star Trek working on it. I was always a fan of the Mission Impossible series, and I came to love what had been created when I was working on it. But Star Wars was something that I loved since I was 11 years old, the first time I saw the very first movie, and it's just something that's been with me in a way that's been with so many people, and it's bigger than all of us. I mean, this world that George Lucas created. So it was intimidating, but it was also the thrill of a lifetime.
Did you ever find in scripting this with Lawrence Kasdan and working within the Star Wars world, what were some of the greatest hurdles? I would imagine you'd have great ideas for a way that the story could go, but then you'd realize that maybe that doesn't work that well within the world of Star Wars.
Well, the the fact is that working with Lawrence Kasdan was such a thrill, and it was an education. The guy wrote some of the best lines you ever heard Han Solo say, or Yoda. He was there at the beginning. So working with him about, talking about what happened in this world since Return of the Jedi, it felt like, this was all about perspective. He brought to it a perspective I never could have, and vice versa. And working with him it felt like an extension of what he had written originally. And it was an incredible thing to throw out ideas and pitch things. And what you realize working on anything is that you're always doing the same thing, which is that you're trying to figure out who is your main character, what motivates them, what makes you care, what makes you interested in them and lean into them.
The essentials.
All the stuff that any one of us who writes goes through on anything. The difference is this happened to be Star Wars, right, and I happened to be doing it with Lawrence Kasdan, who is an icon for me as a filmmaker.
Well, getting down to the essentials and being able to focus on that, is that difficult when you're working on Star Wars? Not just because it's Star Wars and it's bigger than all of us, but because it's Star Wars and it's a part of Disney and it's a part of Lucas and it's been around and it's a bigger,
I was really afraid of that, frankly, that because it was Disney and because it was this big corporate thing and it had been in the news everywhere, it was a $4 billion purchase, that it would be this kind of corporate approach to making a film. And I will tell you, to the remarkable credit of Bob Iger and Alan Horn, they let us make our movie. And I think it was in no small part because Kathy Kennedy was and is one of the great producers of all time. And she was really someone they completely trusted. And little by little, as they started to see dailies and the script and knowing what we were doing, they became very comfortable with what we were doing. But it was something that was a concern of mine, not enough that I wouldn't want to take the chance at making the film, but it ended up being unfounded.
Did you have to sort of create boundaries initially going into it so that wouldn't happen? Or was that something that you were willing to chance and you realized as you were into it, it wasn't happening?
Honestly, you make a movie like this, there are a million small steps. Yeah. You don't go from saying, I'm going to make Star Wars to, looking at the final cut. Every single step is critical. And I'm sure that they were scrutinizing and making sure that we weren't going crazy. But the truth is, I think that with Kathy's, amazing experience and wisdom in this, they felt very comfortable, with her, and I kind of think she protected us as the people who were working on the story. Not to say she wasn't involved in that; she was deeply. But all of us, the entire crew and the cast, this was as much a passion project as anything I've ever seen, let alone been involved in. And the fact that it was also something that happened to be this massive purchase, all that stuff was almost just noise that had nothing to do with this making of the film.
Well, you said your intention was to make the film nothing but delightful, and there's no way to make something delightful if it's not a passion project of any kind and you're not committed to it.
And by the way, just to be clear, delightful doesn't just mean, happy all the time.
Of course not.
Or sweet. Delightful can be the scariest crap you've ever seen. Delightful can be horrifying, but it needed to be something that didn't feel like a programmer, right, where it was sort of like there were boxes that needed to be checked off. They basically said, go make the movie you think should be made. So it's if people don't like it, it's no one's fault but my own.
You've said that you wanted this film as well to be for both boys and girls. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, what I meant by that, first of all, girls and women have loved Star Wars since it came out. That's not the issue. But a lot of times, the toys, for example, were often geared towards boys. There were very few, toys, figures that were made for girls as well. And honestly, Star Wars should be for everyone. That's the whole point. What I was saying as a father of a daughter as well as two sons, I wanted this movie to be something that, where Leia wasn't the only girl. Until Padme, Leia was essentially the only female in that universe. And I really wanted to make sure that this movie felt a little bit more equal in that regard. But there have always been great female characters in Star Wars, and girls and women have loved this world from the beginning. But I do feel like, given that Daisy Ridley, who's extraordinary, by the way, I cannot wait for you to see her, plays a central role in this movie, it felt like something that, women could see themselves in this movie, perhaps in a different way.
Well, she's not playing a princess in this film of any kind. Not to say that Princess Leia wasn't a character of agency right away. She's fighting with Han Solo.
Princess Leia is one of the greatest characters in the history of time. I mean, she's unbelievable. But very much the way, for me, it's the best Star Wars stories are the ones where they're characters who consider themselves ordinary, and they're faced with absolutely insane, extraordinary, desperate situations. And that's very much the story of Daisy's character, Ray.
And you chose to cast Daisy Ridley, who's somewhat unknown, John Boyega, who's fairly unknown. Where did you get the idea to cast unknowns for this film? Was it coming off of the original Star Wars, or?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, seeing Star Wars, you may have seen Harrison Ford in something before. And with the exception of, obviously, Alec Guinness and Peter Cushing, Star Wars was a movie of discovery. So when you saw that film, you didn't think, oh, I know those actors from other things necessarily. Now, of course, these movies live forever, and now people will have seen all sorts of films that, for example, Harrison Ford was in since. But the truth is, at the time, it was, you were meeting Luke. You weren't meeting Mark Hamill. You were meeting Han. You weren't meeting Harrison Ford. And I thought it would be great if in this film there was an opportunity for audiences to meet these characters and not feel like, oh, it's him from that thing, it's her from that thing.
Did you find that your young actors were nervous getting on set for the first time? Were they sort of overwhelmed at all by the sort of?
I think they were a little bit nervous. I think, frankly, we all were a little bit, because immediately there's this ticking clock. You prep and you plan, but all of a sudden you're there and you're shooting. And in this case, we started shooting in Abu Dhabi, and it was 125 degrees, and we had to get a whole bunch of stuff done in those first days. And I know that it was just like, it was a little bit of madness, because we knew the sun was, going to start to go down. We knew we had to finish up this, the stuff we had to get. We couldn't stay another week, so we had to just jam everything in. And I know that it was a little bit crazy, not just because it was so hot and it was the middle of nowhere, but it was also, we had people wearing suits and creature, these sort of animatronic creature suits that were, I don't even know how hot it was in there. And there were like 5 guys in these things. And so we really wanted, it's great in theory to say we want to build and make and have performed live as much as possible. But when you're one of those dudes in that suit, and it's like 140 degrees in there, they're like, great theory, Abrams. I'm dying.
I love hearing that even on like the biggest movie in the world or possibly ever made, you're essentially having the same struggles as an independent film set, which is like, we're losing light. These people are hot. How do we get this
Here's
done?
Here's the thing, and it happened again and again and again. Working on this movie, as crazy, cool, and fun as it was, and it was more challenging and satisfying at every turn than anything I've ever been involved in, for sure. But it's exactly what you're saying. All you care about when it comes down to it is, why do I care? Who are these characters? How do we make this moment as sweet or funny or shocking or exciting as possible? It's exactly the same thing working on an episode of Felicity as it is working on episode 7 of Star Wars. You're always looking to figure out what makes this moment as powerful as possible. And, those are the same challenges again and again and again.
You bring up Felicity, and I've always been kind of curious, because you said that you came to love Star Trek while you were doing it. But your first work regarding Henry, Felicity, some of your early work was not sci-fi based at all. It's a very real approach to telling stories about human beings in reality. I'm wondering, did you ever expect that you would become kind of like the go-to sci-fi filmmaker, director? Was that something that was even in your cards that you wanted? All
I wanted to ever do was be given the chance to tell stories and to make movies, and you never know if you will. But like a lot of my friends, we were just people who loved the process and loved the idea of it and did as much as we could. And I know that if right now I wasn't being given the chance to do it professionally, it would still be something I would be doing as a hobby. And it's something that now, unlike when I was a kid, any one of us can do that. I mean, there are movies being released, theatrical films that are shot on an iPhone. I mean, it's like you have the technology to do and tell any story you want. So I've always loved it. I never strategized what I would be able to do or what my career would be. Of course, you just take advantage of any opportunity that comes your way if it feels right.
Right. So when you get into making Star Wars: The Force Awakens, you've said that some of your influences have been non-sci-fi directors like John Ford or Akira Kurosawa or even Terrence Malick. Do you look at films like that rather than sci-fi films to help ground the story itself, keep you grounded?
Well, I mean, it obviously sounds horribly pretentious to sort of name those great filmmakers and say, those are the filmmakers I miss. But what I was asked specifically about who the some influences on this film were, and in trying to prepare for this movie, of course, watching Star Wars again, I think, for me, I'd seen it so many times, watching those films again was one thing. But I also really wanted to just look at, some of our best filmmakers ever and be reminded of what makes their story so powerful. And sometimes it's about being still and about doing less. And as someone who often, is sort of cutting quickly and moving the camera a lot, my thought was not just to watch what George Lucas did or Kirshner, and sort of say, well, let's take, from Star Wars, but to look at some of the influences that they and we all have had over the years. And so just to re-watch some of the great John Ford movies, Stagecoach, Searchers, Liberty Valance, Grapes of Wrath, or to look at some of the Kurosawa films and to just, see, some of those close-ups that he gets in, Seven Samurai or watching Yojimbo or High and Low. Talk about an education. I mean, just watching those movies are not just entertaining, but they're just so powerful in their confidence. And it was just a good reminder to approach telling the story in a way that wasn't just like, about speed. There's a lot of quick stuff that happens in this movie, and there's a lot of action, but it's also important to let it breathe.
And I love the idea of using Malick as an influence as well. You rarely get that sense of discovery that you get from a Malick film that you would get from a big special effects movie.
But there is no other filmmaker like him. I mean, his movies are just, they're extraordinary. And clearly, Star Wars is not going to be like Badlands. But if you watch,
I would love for it to be.
Although why not? But if
Daisy and John Boyega just going on a killing spree.
Well, that would be something. And by the way, they would probably be psyched. But I think that when you watch, his movies beyond just being gorgeous, again, it's like the power of his composition and it's just something to aspire to. And it's never a bad thing when you're working on something to have sort of touchstones and things that you remember are so much better than you.
Going down into the nitty-gritty of this Star Wars versus the previous Star Wars, I'm curious how you approached the effects, not just practical versus CGI, but episodes 1 through 3 came out 20 years after episodes 4 through 6, and not just the CGI, but the technology that the characters have in episodes 1 through 3 is far greater than the technology the characters have in 4 through 6. So how did you sort of reconcile that with your story and how it references those two very separate worlds?
It was important that some technology progressed since Return of the Jedi. So, for example, it wouldn't be a Star Wars movie without stormtroopers, without X-Wings, without TIE fighters, but the idea of what those looked like, again, and going back and looking at all the amazing stuff that George Lucas did, and in the prequels alone, there is so, in terms of aliens, locale, ships, I mean, there's so much that was done. It was incredible. I just felt like, in a way, I wanted to try and go a little bit retro, if that makes sense. And the weird thing to me is that when George Lucas did Star Wars, he wanted to do Flash Gordon and then couldn't get the rights, and he ended up creating Star Wars. And Star Wars came out 40 years after Flash Gordon, and our movie came out, or is coming out, about 40 years after Star Wars. And I have this, of course, it is a literal Star Wars movie, but I felt like there was something powerful. And I know an older audience might call it retro, but there was something, and in fact, some people did when Star Wars came out. They said this is like a Saturday morning serial. And George did amazing things. He borrowed things, that were his influence, like the crawl at the beginning, straight out of Flash Gordon. The rebels against the Imperial fighters, straight out of Flash Gordon.
The last shot of A New Hope is straight out of Flash Gordon. It's them receiving medals on the stage.
Yeah,
it looks exactly like a Flash Gordon stage.
But he was inspired by things that for him were sort of callbacks, and for some audience members, retro. But for me, I just felt like going simpler in a way was a powerful choice. So, for example, the the stormtroopers, obviously, they look very much like stormtroopers, but they're essentially the white with a little bit of an adjustment. Some of the technology that you'll see on some of the screens, one of the droids, the sort of star droid in our movie BB-8, he's got a little hologram moment, and you'll see that his hologram is a little bit more advanced. But little things like that where they're very subtle, but I wanted to make sure that as much as possible we were adhering to a kind of trajectory that was established in 4, 5, and 6, and not necessarily jump to some crazy high-tech thing where that overshadowed the characters of the story.
Right. I mean, you definitely have kind of a crazy high-tech thing when it comes to episodes 1 through 3. You have like a post-Matrix influence on a lot of the fight scenes. So how did you approach? I know you have said that with lightsaber battles, you sort of went a little amateurish for them,
But the
right?
truth is, I don't know how we would ever top the kind of choreography that George did in the prequels. I mean, the lightsaber battles in those movies were so acrobatic, and yes, I guess in theory there is a way to do it, and maybe Rian Johnson will take that approach. But I wouldn't know how to out choreograph the amazing stuff that George did in those movies. So for me, there was something about going back to a slightly simpler. To me, the great lightsaber battles were conversations. I mean, they were dramatic scenes that were sort of playing out over these weapons, and that's what we tried to do in this movie, and make it a little bit more brutal and rough, and less trained and stylized.
What was your greatest challenge making this movie? It sounds like everything sort of went to plan from the beginning, but I imagine there was one great challenge or one story hurdle that it took a while to get over.
I guess one of the biggest challenges was just in the story of it. And in a weird way, this challenge was true in every aspect of the movie, from plot to design to, frankly, the score, which is how do we embrace and accept and exploit the very thing we're inheriting, and at the same time do something new. So one of the approaches that we took was to say, look, there's some fundamental tenets of Star Wars that should be true in this movie. And someone I work with said that it's like a Western, which is really the right thing, because if you look at a Western, there's probably going to be a dusty town. There's probably going to be a saloon. There's probably going to be a bad guy. There's probably going to be a good. I mean, like, there are just these fundamental things you're going to see again and again. And to embrace those things and say, you know what, I want to see the bad guys be threatening. They're going to have some kind of a weapon. They are going to be threatening with something, and we got to know that they mean business. There need to be heroes, but for me, my favorite heroes are ones that don't come from places of power, but rather places of in the middle of nowhere, places of no note whatsoever. And the idea of seeing these nobodies become somebody, the biggest challenge was in the plot, how much of what we know should we incorporate? And when does it start to feel like, oh, you're just ripping that off and telling the same story? So what I'm hoping is, while there are many things that you go, oh yeah, that feels like Star Wars, that feels like Star Wars, the real story we're telling is something that you haven't seen before.
Were there any holdouts with the original cast, getting them on board, or were they game right away?
Well, I was very lucky that they all came on board before I did.
Okay.
So when I signed on, I didn't have to go over to Harrison's house and beg him to be in the movie. So.
I think we have some time for audience Q&A. Does anyone have questions out here?
Hi, thank
Hello.
you for coming.
Thanks for being
I'm a
here.
huge fan.
Oh, thank
so I have a question about, what do you prefer creating for TV or film, and what do you like about each medium?
Thank you for your question. I love both. And I think the thing about TV is that right now there are more opportunities for originality, for edgier, weirder, more groundbreaking stuff. I think one of the reasons that you hear people say often now that it's the golden age of television is because some of the most interesting stories are being told in that medium. I also love that now, as opposed to when I began working in TV, serialized storytelling is embraced rather than rejected. When we worked on Alias, we were told by the end of the second season, no more serialized stories, which for me was the whole idea of the show. It was one long kind of story, and all of a sudden we were unable to tell the story the way we wanted to. I wish that we, could have continued in that vein. Movies are incredible because there is a sense, obviously, of a beginning, middle, and an end. And the scale of a movie, I once heard this thing on the radio about the relationship between you and TV is that you're the parent and TV is the child. It's in the house, you turn it on, you turn it off, you sort of tell it what it's going to show you. And you to a movie is that you're the child, and it's the parent. It's bigger than you. You go to it. You're sort of looking up to it. You're watching, and I kind of love that power of what movies are and the scale, the scope, and also obviously what you're able to do. If this episode 7 had been a TV show, we wouldn't have been able to get past the crawl. Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, JJ. I'm a big Star Wars fan.
Cool.
I've loved it since elementary. The first time I saw it was back in '95 when they released the VHS version of that.
Right on. And
my question to you is, how is it like combining new stars with the older stars of the original trilogy?
That's a good question. Well, it was great, and it was great because obviously the original cast is spectacular, but we were so lucky to cast a spectacular new cast. I don't know if you've seen Attack the Block, but John Boyega is amazing. He's incredibly confident and powerful and funny and vulnerable and amazing. So getting to work with him was great, and Daisy Ridley I cannot say enough about. There are people like Oscar Isaac, who's already sort of proven but not quite known as much in the mainstream as I think he will be, and Adam Driver, who's amazing in Girls, but in this movie plays a character that no one's seen him play yet. We were so lucky to have this group of young actors. If they hadn't worked well with the original actors, and by the way, who knew, right? You kind of go there and you're like, well, let's try it. And we did the read-through, did some rehearsals, but the truth is, you don't know until you're really there doing it. And look, I suppose lesser actors would have felt jealous of the younger actors and maybe not made it quite so easy for them or tried to get in on their action. We had Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Mark Hamill, from Peter Mayhew to Anthony Daniels. I mean, they were so embracing of the new generation and somehow understood this is a generational story, and for it to live on and to be part of it, you've got to really give it to this new cast. And so everyone was working to the same end, and when you see these new, I call them kids, but when you see these new actors with the established characters, it's some of I think the most fun stuff in the movie is their dynamic, and it's as funny and as sweet and heartfelt as anything, and it really is a testament to all of them for working so well together.
You mentioned Mark Hamill, and everybody that I asked when I said, hey, I'm interviewing J.J. Abrams, what should I ask him? They said, ask him where Luke is. Ask him where Mark Hamill is. And he's not on the poster, right? Can you talk a little bit about the intention behind that?
Sure. I can't tell you where Mark is right this second. I have no idea. But I can say that the big thing for me is not wanting to ruin the story. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone to see a trailer or I've gone to see a movie and there's been a trailer. And literally I feel like the movie plays out from beginning to end in this crazy, encapsulated way. And I always wonder why they did that. I know they need to sell movies, and they need to tell people kind of what they're going to buy a ticket for. But in this case, it felt appropriate, given the story, to not include him in the trailer or the poster, but not because we want to be jerks, but because we want people to have fun when they go. So it's intentional, but it's not for any other reason than we want the experience of actually seeing the movie and seeing the story to be one that feels satisfying.
Next question.
Should we give this person here a question? Right on. Stand by.
Hi,
now, I'm not doing this because you look like me. Turn around. Turn around. Just see. That's not why.
Yeah, I actually specifically dressed up as you. For
Well, then
this.
it worked.
Thanks. So first, I just gotta say I'm so excited for the movie.
Thanks.
Looks amazing. So what I was wondering was you said you were seeing Star Wars when you were 11,
Mm-hmm.
and it's influenced millions of people. Two things. How has it truly influenced you and your life and morals? And can you sign this?
Okay, I never should have asked you. to ask a question. No, I'm kidding. I'm happy to sign whatever you got, of course. What's your name? Jonah. Okay. First of all, Jonah, I think the thing that was really the biggest influence for me was a sense that anything is possible. Like when I saw Star Wars, first of all, it looked like nothing else I'd ever seen. Like it was every sci-fi, and I never really thought of Star Wars as sci-fi as much as kind of fantasy, but every movie that had those kind of special effects before Star Wars always felt like I knew how they did everything. You'd look at it, you go, oh, that's clearly a model. Oh, I see, that was a matte painting, or I see how they did that thing. Star Wars suddenly had ships flying in like 3 dimensions, across the stars, past planets, had, explosions like I'd never seen before, creatures that I'd never seen before, a kind of, aesthetic that was amazing. But the best thing about it was how funny it was. It was about loyalty. It was about discovering new family, about friendship. It was about the title, A New Hope, which was such an appropriate title for it, because the movie made me feel hopeful that that anything was possible, that any average person could not only go out and cross paths with and actually become deeply good and important friends with amazing personalities, but that there was this thing called the Force. And the idea that there was this power that binds us all together, it wasn't about religion. It was this idea that there was, and it just felt so right, that we're all somehow connected. And to me, that was just an amazing, chilling idea. And I think we all would like to feel that when push comes to shove in desperate moments, that we could all harness that kind of a power. So for me, it was not just about what's possible in movies, but what George Lucas did in that film was kind of give me an amazing sense of what was possible in life and in the world.
Did Lucas have any involvement in the film at all? Was he around?
He was so amazing and generous. I use the word amazing a lot, so I'll stop. But George was amazing. No, George called. I've known him for a little while and before this, and he called and said, if you're going to do this movie, it's going to be your thing. I won't be involved in it. And he was very generous in that regard. And I know Kathy Kennedy was brought in before the Disney came in. So he'd been working with Kathy very closely. And he was always available, but the truth is, I asked him at a certain point if he'd want to see stuff, and he says, no, I want to see it when it's all done. So I think for the first time, he felt like, I think he even was quoted saying this, he wanted to see a Star Wars movie the way other people did.
That's so funny because there's that SNL bit that you introduced where Bobby Moynihan was playing him hanging around the snack table, like trying to have his say in the movie a little bit.
In fairness, when I did that introduction, I hadn't seen the bit. And then I watched it, I was like, oh, look. Bobby's a friend and incredibly funny, but obviously, everything that we are doing is standing on the shoulders of what George built.
Last question, I think, from the audience.
Hi, JJ. Big
Hello.
fan.
Thank you.
So my question to you is, what was the biggest obstacle for you when you took on such a big franchise like Star Wars, where there's this passionate fan base?
I think that I sort of vaguely answered that, but the biggest challenge was just having to figure out what to incorporate and what not to. And also knowing that there are fans who care so much about this, and that was a huge responsibility. Should we do one more question?
Yeah, let's do one. We'll do one more question.
Hi, JJ. I was curious, how many lens flares did you actually want to include, and how many made the cut?
I've heard you answer this. Less lens flares, right?
Oh, here's the thing. First of all, excellent question. Secondly, I know that I went a little bonkers with lens flares, and when I started working on this, for many reasons, I wanted to stop the lens flare addiction that I had. I went to a 12-step program, and I feel like I'm recovering. But the truth is that my wife called out one day. I was showing her something from Star Trek Into Darkness that I was working on, and she literally could not see the actor that was speaking, and she was like, JJ, seriously, this has to stop. So for that reason, but also because I knew that was just not the aesthetic. I started doing that in Star Trek mostly because I wanted it to have the sense that the future was so bright it couldn't be contained in the frame, and and yet I did it again on Super 8 for no reason other than I thought it was cool looking. Though there are some flares in this movie, they're all flares that could not be avoided. They weren't flares that were purposely done by shining a ridiculously powerful halogen flashlight into the lens. But thank you.
Flares or no flares, I think everybody's going to see the movie. Do I have to plug it for you guys? I think you're going to see it, right? JJ, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
December 18th, everybody. Star Wars: The Force Awakens.